Today I'm going to talk about the main music fraternities and the uneasy relationship that often exists between rock bands and orchestral musicians, together with the role of electricity in music and the implications that that has and sound levels and that sort of thing. I'd like to think that, given that I'm a member of both of these camps, that I can offer a balanced viewpoint, and part of this is based on sort of experiences that I've had, whether it be in a recording session or at a gig or wherever, in a music venue. So why is there this uneasy relationship? What's it all about? Because it is there. There are lots of people who are lucky enough never to have that uneasy relationship with this sort of, with their opposite counterparts, as it were. A rock musician with a classical player or the other way round. Well, based on my first-hand experience and just generally over the years, let's begin with the classical player's attitude to the rock musician. So, looking from the point of view of the classical player, lots and lots and lots of hours, massive chunks of their lives spent practicing. Now, I know this does apply to rock and pop players as well, but generally speaking, if you're in a sort of professional capacity as a classical musician, you've probably gone through music college, you've got a music degree, huge amounts of work, possibly a lot of money to attend those courses, at least now at any rate. But orchestral rank and file players are really on quite a poor wage for the work that they do, and the fact that they're at the sort of the beck and call perhaps of the orchestra in which they're employed. There could be any number of reasons why classical players really, the rank and file ones at least, can have a bit of a grumble about the money because it ain't that good. So orchestra funding in the UK at least is really on the slide, and it's dreadful. It's not good, because large swathes of our musical culture is that it's under threat. Partly the sort of the change in music consumption. We don't buy CDs or records anymore, really. It's all online, and you don't find teenagers and children, who are the drivers of the music industry, going to classical gigs, concerts. Doesn't really happen. So there's also seemingly high price for admission, to the layman at least, but you've got to remember that an orchestra, a full modern symphony orchestra, has got 90 players odd, of that order. And they need to be paid. They need to earn a living for the fantastic service that they indeed provide. So a classically trained musician might ask, why is it that musicians can get by without reading music, and why should they? Are they musicians at all if they don't have theoretical or music reading notation knowledge? Well, of course they are. Paul McCartney apparently can't read music. Doesn't matter. Really, he's only the member of the songwriter in the biggest supergroup ever. He's got a great ear and great theory, obviously. Django Reinhardt, he couldn't even read or write his own language, let alone that of music, and he came up with compositions that were, standards, that were trend-setting. Music is an auditory art form, really. We've only written it down for 500 or 600 years. Before that, it's all just, handed down kind of thing. So it's important to keep that in mind. So leaving these two artists, Paul McCartney and Django Reinhardt, aside, and all the other talented artists there are, unfortunately, the bare fact over the years, and this is what does rile some classical players, is that lots of rock and pop players really, some of them say they shouldn't have ever had access to guitars and basses and drums. It's people who are just making a row. But we've got to remember what rock and roll is, the very essence of it, because it's about post-war rebellion, the first generation, post-war generation, to have, freedoms of expression that their forebears could only have, well, it's unthinkable really, but political freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, that sort of thing. And one of those things was to make a lot of noise. So that's one way of looking at it. Something else that a classical player may say is, why is it all so simple? It all sounds the same. Well, you could say that the other way. I'm not a particular fan of Vivaldi, but a rock song may have 3 chords, but the classical era, roughly 1750 to 1820, 1830, was mostly based on tonic and dominant. So that's 2 chords, but the way in which it was done was more subtle and more exploratory. So there are 2 sides to this. And of course, I'd love to get a good row going, so feel free to leave some comments in the box below. So, moving on. There's the rock player's attitude to the classical musician. So this is kind of the other way around now. And this is, of course, based on things that I've seen as well. Before even meeting, a session or a gig or whatever, there's sometimes the assumption by the rock player that the classical player will be some sort of musical snob, to sort of that's an uneasy relationship from the word go, but that's rarely true, very rarely true. Of course, you get the sort of prima donnas, and well, that's just a personality thing rather than a music thing. But lots of classical players I know are hugely excited to be asked to be employed or to work with a rock band or rock musicians. So they're hugely excited by that prospect, because it's another form of music, and any musician who is worth their salt will engage with other musical forms, whether it be jazz or soul or classical music or baroque or whatever it is, modern Russian contemporary classical music, whatever it is. A musician should engage in these things to get further, knowledge and to develop their own playing and their own composition. So really, there's something else as well. The rock player may think, well, why can't the classical player improvise? Why do they need everything written down? I can't write music. Why do they need it written down? There's more tension there. But lots of classical players do know how to improvise. A classical player has scales drilled into them from day one. So if they know what the key is, there's a good chance that they'll be, it might not sound like rock or blues, but it's improvising. And actually a church organist has to do that on a very regular basis. Sunday morning service has to, the organist may be playing a, voluntary, and gets to the end of it, but there's still people coming in, so they think, I'll just go around again, or try something else, or just improvise on a theme of, and that is done a lot of the time. So, there are more things in common between the rock players and the classical players than perhaps we think. So there's also the thing where rock bands tend to write all their own music, whereas an orchestral player will spend a vast majority of their time reading and playing somebody else's composition. So that's important to remember, that a classical player can go through years and years of orchestral experience without actually writing anything. So, but they may have written something at music college or done or get involved in other projects, but there are some players who don't do that. And the rock equivalent, I suppose, would be a tribute band, where you concentrate on the sounds and the specific lines and all of that sort of thing. So, more parallels. So, then the next thing is that sometimes the communication on a session between a rock player and a classical player may be quite strained, because they're sort of talking in different ways, even though it's speaking the same language. Music is all the styles of music, they're dialects of the same language. Could think of it like that. And it's about somebody from, deepest South Wales understanding somebody from Glasgow, or somebody in Belfast understanding somebody from Suffolk. It's, I don't know, pretty much everyone that speaks English is intelligible to each other, but that's kind of the principle I'm getting at. So, why can't rock players write out stuff for classical players to play? Why do they? Sometimes I've seen an instance where a rock player is sort of singing a line to a cellist who's thinking, well, I don't know, where's the rhythm? Where's beat one? Where do you want this? How loud do you want it? Where, whatever. There are a lot of things that rock players could do to make that slightly easier. And of course, the classical player to sort of be able to listen to or read chord sequences. I know lots of classical players who can't read a chord chart. C major 7, you think, oh, what's that? Or C9, whatever, C7 flat 9. So there are definite advantages to both camps, both the rock and pop and the classical players, to engage in each other's art forms in sort of a notation type of a way. So there's all sorts of things that all sorts of things that can happen, and you very often find that a producer, a really good record producer, will be able to manage these relationships between the two fraternities with ease. Very often you'll find that a producer has had some classical training, perhaps, and some rock and has worked in studios. So a classical player could unite the lead singer of Pantera with a local viola player who's been called in to play on a record. They're speaking the same language, just in slightly different ways. But if you can manage that, if you're the producer, you're almost the musical interpreter to make a session work. Now, orchestral sounds are a great addition to a rock and pop song. They're brilliant, really useful, and there are loads and loads of plugins that can do that. But we've got to be a bit careful here, because plugins really are a stopgap for pre-production. If you're writing music and you want some strings, you might just play some in on a keyboard. But when it comes to it, there are many, many things that live players can do that plugins can't do. And indeed, guitar sounds, if you're playing electric guitar on a keyboard, that's obvious when it doesn't work. So it goes both ways. Now, a string player, for example, I'm a violinist, would not adhere strictly to the 12-note system, the equal temperament, which is the tuning system that we use almost exclusively. A string player will actually change the pitch of notes ever so slightly to match the harmony or the melodic content. So that's very important to understand that happens. And a guitarist will play with hammer-ons or slides or vibrato or whatever, and indeed the vibrato may change speed, intensity. It may start halfway through a note, or it may start at the beginning of a note. So there's lots and lots of things to consider. Now, moving on, the main sort of other contentious issue that I was going to discuss was volume levels, sound intensity and sound energy. Now, as a rock musician who does gigs, I very often go to a venue and the sound limiter installed. And I know lots of rock players who sort of groan when they see the sound limiter. Partly because what they are is they limit the sound by shutting the power if it goes above a certain level, and it's all to do with the sort of health and safety aspect of it. I'll come to that in a minute. Why are there no sound limiters in orchestral venues? Of course you can't shut the power off, because an orchestra is completely, doesn't need any electricity at all. So can't do that. Why would you not have a sound limiter in a railway station? Well, don't know. Why not? Shopping centre, swimming pool, etc. Now, it's really from a classical player's standpoint, I know some who get sort of a bit angry about this because they think, well, a rock musician can control their volume completely from 0 to maximum. It's easy to do. However, let's just go back to the bare bones of what rock and roll is. Essentially, it's a post-war rebellion of the youth generation. Basically, the first after the war to have complete freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of everything. And one of those freedoms was to make a lot of noise when it came to music. And suddenly, with amplification, with electric guitars, you could do that. And drum kits, you could make a row. And that's what happened, and that's what I do know annoys some classical players. They can't listen to it because they think they don't really understand why it is that there is this row, as they describe. Loudness is one of the vehicles of the rebellion, and I love loudness. I play bass, and I play in a rock band. It may be, I don't know, Black Sabbath or AC/DC. I love it. I get caught up in it, and I don't play many rock gigs, but when I do, it's great. It's like driving a fast car. So, relating this back to sound limiters, there is really only one driver of the volume at a small gig, whether it be a pub or club or whatever, and that is the drum kit. Now, when you consider that, when you stop and think about that, the guitarist, the bass player, the keyboard player, they have amplifiers on stage, and a singer is rarely louder than a drum kit. So it's going to be the drums that determine this, and drums over the years have been designed so that they have more efficiency of loudness and tone. So compare a 1940s Slingerland drum kit with organic heads, that is animal skins or sort of whatever it is, whatever they were, to a Yamaha 9000 from the 1980s that is engineered to be really powerful. That's what's happened. So bass players, guitarists, they have to turn their amps up in order to match the drums. Now, in sound limiter terms, it's all about the bass. So 80% of the actual energy in the sound wave is below 200 hertz. So if we relate this to the piano, that's roughly 80% is to the left of middle C and 20% to the right. So give or take, that's quite a sort of unusual, sort of a weighted distribution. So if the bass player stops playing at a gig with a sound limiter, the limiter will suddenly register much, much less level. And if there's a PA and the bass drum is going through the PA, the bass drum stopping will also affect that sound limiter. Lots of the other instruments, it doesn't generate as much energy. So that's something to be careful of. Now, size of venue is also a factor. An orchestra playing in the Albert Hall, for example, it's a massive room, huge room, lots of people to soak up the sound, and indeed those people are sighted away from the source by quite a long way. The front row, you're 10 metres at least from the first violins or the cellos, whatever, and then obviously the orchestra further back, the louder instruments. So, there's a difference there. If you're in a little club or a venue, got lots of hard surfaces and loud PA systems. Now, a PA system is, if you've got a small PA system that's working really hard, it's going to be throwing out a lot of very high, harsh treble frequencies, especially if you've got a small amplifier and big speakers. A small amplifier will be sending square waves through these big speakers because it can't control them adequately. So if you've got a really hefty power amp and small speakers, the chances are you'll actually get a better sound, and distortion is a driving factor with things like hearing loss. Now, this is what I'm going to talk about next, because actually I have moderate hearing loss from doing lots and lots of gigs with no ear protection, so young and stupid. I now wear earplugs and use in-ear monitoring to reduce my exposure to raw sound energy. Talking about closing the gate after the horse has bolted, but the horse hasn't quite bolted yet. I've just caught it. my frequency response of my ears is about 50 decibels down at 2 kilohertz. That's quite a lot. That is a lot. But I've got used to this over the years. People don't complain about my mixes. If I do any mastering or any sort of production, people don't go, we have masses of mid-range to compensate for my own loss. So I've got used to it over the years. But there is a problem with that, in that if your response goes any lower or goes too low with a particular frequency, the brain will actually forget that frequency. It'll forget it's even there, and you'll never get it back. Not even with a hearing aid. Consider the multiplication of something times 0. It's always going to be 0. So that's a problem. So what I do now is I don't get tinnitus, luckily. Tinnitus, if you get tinnitus a lot, you've got to really watch out. Really, really watch out. So the sort of audiologists, because I had my hearing tested and I went to the optician, I had an audiologist basically say, yeah, you're down at 2 kilohertz. They don't test anything above about 4 kilohertz because they're not interested in anything but speech. Speech is the driving thing. So I have no idea what my response is like at 20 kilohertz. Or 16. Well, I know that the 16 kilohertz slider on my old graphic equalizer, I can hear the difference. Still at quite a small difference. If I raise it 306 dB, I can still hear the difference. So I'm okay. Just. Now, what I do is I get in-ear monitoring, which is a pair of condenser mics into a mixing desk, into a pair of headphones, or earphones actually, that seal against my ears. And I take those to gigs now, and I position it between myself, the bass player or guitarist or keyboards or whatever, and the drum kit. And then I put it's a single mic stand with 2 mics on it, and I just put it to wherever I feel is the best mix. So I don't have to rely on any sort of expensive sort of iPads or digital mixing desks or anything like that. And that's what I do. And because it's in stereo, you can pick out left and right quite easily, which means you can have the volume lower. That's really important. Mono mixes, you have to have them loud. Stereo mixes, you can have them much quieter because you've got this spatial awareness going on. Now, you will find sound energy charts. You'll find warning charts on practice rooms or in venues, and basically you can, it's sort of what it says is you can have a certain sound level for a certain time. So it's something like 97 decibels for half an hour, and then every 3D above that you halve your exposure times. That's 15 minutes. 15 minutes for 100 decibels, 103 for 7.5 minutes, and so on and so forth, until you get to 140, which is basically permanent hearing damage. So the exposure time for that is 0. Never ever do that. No, not a good idea. But you'll find that these things are up in practice rooms in music colleges. Now, don't think that it's just the classical fraternity that get away with it, because actually they do not. I know many classical players who are really struggling. If you're a clarinetist and you're sat in front of the trumpet section and you're on some dramatic symphony somewhere and you get blasted by 120 decibels or whatever can come out the front end of a trombone, that is, that's going to damage you if you're rehearsing all the time. And as a violinist, if I'm in close quarters with my instrument for extended periods, I can get quite tired. Violin is loud. It's a loud instrument. If you sat in the outside or the inside desk of the first or the outside desk of the second violins, you're surrounded by other violins who are playing forte. It's going to be loud, and you will suffer the consequences. So even a cheap pair of earplugs is better than nothing, because you only get one pair of ears. There is no, we can't have an ear transplant. You can have an operation, but your brain is clever. Your brain knows when your ears are completely destroyed, And unfortunately, it can't do anything about that. It can't repair anything. You know, our the ear is a very complex thing. It wears out from day one. You know, and our ancestors had the same kind of, you know, parts of the ear that we've got now, but they had to cope with, you know, a few waves and thunderstorms or whatever. And now in the world of music, we have this problem, and we've all got to look out for ourselves, especially us musicians.